We are watching our non-stop coverage of the G20. I'm Gargi Raut. It's been a landmark day today for India on the world stage. There have been remarkable achievements today. The G20 summit at the start began with the inclusion of the African Union in the G20. Remember, that is something India had been pushing for, Prime Minister Modi had been pushing for. And then at the start of the second session at around 3:30, the Prime Minister, at the beginning, he addressed the gathering and announced that he had some happy news that a consensus had been arrived at on the Delhi Declaration. Remember, there had been a lot of speculation around this, a lot of talk about the challenges that were, there, given the obstacles, especially the wording around Russia and Ukraine and the Ukraine war. There was even some obstacles on the climate change wording as well. But lo and behold, it had been arrived at. The Delhi Declaration announced today itself, not on the last day as everyone was expecting that there would be this mad dash and scramble and trying to get it all together. No, it happened today itself. So it's been absolutely an incredible landmark day for India on the world stage. The manner in which we have managed these achievements one after the other, and all the agreements that have come about during the G20 as well. Leaders of the G20 nations reiterated their national positions on the Ukraine war. So it's interesting to read, the way the paragraphs are worded, resolutions adopted at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly. And they all underscored that all states must act in a manner consistent with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter in its entirety. And there was no mention of Russia in the Delhi Declaration, and there was also that line that said this is not the era of war, something the Prime Minister has said earlier as well. Well, let's just take a look at this interview to us by Amitabh Kant, who the Sherpa for India, and he talks about how there were 500 drafts and 200 hours of non-stop negotiations to finally arrive at the Delhi Declaration.
India's Sherpa at the G20, Amitabh Kant, joining us now. Thanks, Mr. Kant, very much for being with us. My first question to you, how did you manage to get several countries around the world to accept or understand the Ukraine-Russia issue?
Well, Vishnu, this was about close to 200 hours of non-stop negotiations. And the Bali para had broken down. We were struggling with it for 9 months. So in the Sofa Talk meeting, we just took a plain screen and I scribbled down about 15 principles which we should follow. And then all the Sherpas joined in and gave their perspective on it, and all of them we took. Based on that, we did the first draft. And nobody expected this that we'll arrive at a consensus. Then on the first draft, we had a number of reactions. We started with that comment, we went to the second draft, we went to the third draft. But I think after that, the bilateral meetings with each country, important thing was to draw the red lines of each country. We drew the red lines of each country, and then we worked on a draft, and then several rounds of negotiations, and with bilaterals with each Sherpa. But I think the important thing that really worked was that I was working in partnership with the Brazilian Sherpa, the South African Sherpa, and finally I got the Indonesian Sherpa together. So it became a joint proposal of 4 emerging markets. And then I roped in Mexico, I roped in Turkey, I roped in all the other Saudi. So all of them joined hands. And because there was so much of pressure from the emerging markets, because our concern was that for us, development, growth issues are far more important than the war issue. So finally, we then negotiated with G7 countries. We then negotiated with Russia. We then negotiated with China. And only last night, I think we gave them the final draft. We took it to the last minute, gave them the final draft. And at that Sherpa meeting, I've told them that this is the final draft, because I've discussed with you in over 200 bilaterals about 5 different drafts. This is the final document which we have produced, which is progressive, which is based on UN principles, UN charters. Either you take it or the deal drops. And I also told them that if anybody has an objection to this, your leader can go and talk to my leader, which is the Prime Minister. So I pulled the weight of the Prime Minister into this at that time. As the Sherpa, I pulled the weight of the Prime Minister. I said, I will not discuss anymore. I've done 200 rounds of discussion. And if your leader feels strongly about it, go and tell the Prime Minister of India. And my leader has given me the direction to do that. This is a perfect draft, and we've taken care of every country's concern. And it's very critical. We will not have a split para. We'll not have a footnote. We'll only have a consensus. And that's how it worked. And today morning, all countries fell in line and they all joined and collaborated with us. So that has been the driving force. But I'll tell you the story on another day at greater length, because I have to just zip for another meeting. Yeah.
No, 1 second. I have another question to ask you, but you've also achieved something very important. You have ensured that Russian food exports will be promoted. In a sense, if the word Russia was included in the document, then Russia would not have signed on. But there's an incentive for Russia in this particular context, and it's a win-win for all sides. That's my interpretation. Is that correct?
The important thing to understand is that while we are not condemning or deploring anything, we are forcing everybody to go down to the UN principles, UN charters. And we are saying that territorial integrity, sovereignty, political independence, and territorial acquisition is non-doable. So we are pinning down everyone.
All right, Amitabh Kant, they're describing, the kind of effort that went in to arrive at that final Delhi declaration, and how many hours it took of, meetings with all the other delegates, and finally hammering that out, and the surprise announcement today itself that a consensus had been arrived at. Let's go across to Vasudha, and there we can see the visuals from the Bharat Mandapam, all lit up this evening, beautifully lit up. Vasudha, if you'll tell us, firstly, huge achievements today. It started with the announcement of the African Union, a part of the G20, the Prime Minister announcing that. Then the Prime Minister midday in the afternoon announcing that the consensus had been arrived at on the Delhi Declaration. And then the announcement of the US, India, UAE and Saudi, the rail link, etc., all that trade corridor announcement being made. So a day of huge achievements.
Yes, absolutely, Gargi. Today marks a big diplomatic achievement for the country. And, I would just quote External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar's words on this. He said that India's G20 presidency has actually made India world ready and world India ready. So I think that really sums up the kind of effort that India put into its G20 presidency, taking it to the smallest of small towns and ensuring that people of the country also get a taste of what diplomacy looks like. So that was a major thing. And of course, this Delhi Declaration that came about is very important because it is without footnotes, it's without a chair summary. That means it has full consensus. Remember, it's a multilateral platform, so every country has the right to veto. So all countries have actually agreed with India's efforts to basically strike a consensus. So that basically becomes all the more important. But other than that, India has also ensured that its G20 agenda does not get derailed with questions on geopolitics, on things that it does not have control over. So it also leaves behind a legacy, if you see, because DPI, Digital Public Infrastructure, or One Future Alliance, something that India has proposed and something that India has pitched, and now it has been accepted. A formation of a lateral institution to ensure streamlining of digital services, digital governance, and ensuring that developing countries also get benefits of digital governance like India did, using India's DPI and UPI as templates. That is one thing that is going to happen. Now, DPI is going to be part of G20 Financial Inclusion Action Plan from next year. So that is a huge achievement. Apart from that, India also leaves behind a legacy in the inclusion of African Union. This is in line with the Prime Minister's push for representing all voices and for India's emergence as a major voice for the voice of the global South. So these are some very important sort of like takeaways which have happened. Apart from that, of course, the gender bit, talking about digital divide, talking about women's work, participation in workforce, and ensuring that every woman who works is counted as a working woman. These are certain things which other presidencies have not really looked at. So these are some very important things. Cryptocurrency, a framework for a recommendation group has been put in place. So these are certain very important takeaways which India has negotiated, apart from ensuring that the Ukraine-Russia war does not really derail its agenda. So all in all, it shows, work that has gone into this for the last 10 months. It's just not an academic exercise or a diplomatic exercise. They've made it into a people-centric thing, which means talking to people in their own country, but also ensuring that they have the ability to get people from other countries agreeable to its diplomatic vision.
Right, Vasudha. Well, now that the work is over for today, and now it's time for dinner. The president hosting, Draupadi Murmu is hosting the delegates and the leaders in a dinner. We can see the prime minister along with the president greeting those who are arriving. This is at a hall at the Bharat Mandapam. So again, Vasudha, the prime minister, giving that personal touch. He's there with the president, greeting all the arrivals.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a cultural program organized for all the foreign delegates. It has about 77 artists from every state, union territory of the country. They've been skilled, they've been trained for the last few months. And every musical instrument that India has produced in the last many years is going to be part of this musical performance. And it also will have a fusion of Carnatic, Hindustani, Bhakti traditions, and also folk music. So a lot of effort has gone into not just the policy aspect of India's G20 presidency, but also projecting India's cultural and civilizational richness.
All right. Thanks so much, Vasudha, for joining us. With that, well, let's now go across to our guest to discuss all the achievements of today and the significance. We're joined by Vikramjit Singh Sahni, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha. Thank you so much for joining us. Saurabh Shukla, founder, newsmobile.in. Daniel Marquez, Senior Advisor, South Asia, USIP. Michael Boshaku, Global Affairs Analyst, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Professor Jeffrey David Sachs, American economist and academic. And in studio with us, Fauzan Alavi, Executive Director, Alana Sons Private Limited, India's oldest and biggest agri-export house. We're going to talk about all these big achievements of the day. Thank you so much all for joining us. And Michael Boshaku, I'd like to start with you. Your comments on the Delhi Declaration. There was so much speculation that how it was a struggle, how it would be, tough to get it on the final day. And we had it on day one. No mention of Russia, though there has been, there's been talk about the suffering that took place in Ukraine.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Well, I mean, first of all, we have to point out that these declarations are non-binding, basically, on member states. In other words, there's no punishment if they don't follow it. I would have liked to have seen, along the lines of the declaration in Bali, stronger condemnation of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. The reason for that is that if these statements tend to be watered down, which I believe this one is, okay, kudos to India for putting it all together, trust me. However, right. If there isn't proper strong condemnation, then I think what it does, it embolders other dictators and autocrats to do the same. The part about the grain deal is very, very important. I'm actually temporarily based in Odessa most of the time. And but however, I noticed that it kind of points the finger at both Ukraine and Russia to resolve this. Well, excuse me, but it was the Russians who blockaded the Black Sea, who are currently night after night after night destructing Ukrainian port infrastructure, which is a crucial part of the global supply chain. So it would have been nice to see stronger words on that. But again, it's good that these words came out. They're non-binding. I think a lot of work was done behind the scenes. And finally, if I can, I think it's good to see India shifting a little bit more from its kind of non-aligned stance to more an activist stance on this war in Ukraine. If any country should understand the importance of sovereignty and territorial integrity, it should be India. So hence, I'd like to see them play more of a leadership role in that regard.
All right, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, your comments and you know, it's been quite an achievement for India. It's quite an extensive document touching upon many points. It even talks about, you know, promotion of Russian food items. So there's been a huge amount of negotiations that have gone in. Each country had their red lines. It required a lot of skill, a lot of jugglery, but finally India managing to pull this off.
It's a real achievement, no question. I'm also delighted that the African Union has been invited to become essentially the 21st member. This is also a breakthrough that will serve the world well and will serve India-Africa relations well for years to come. We are seeing the shift from a North Atlantic-led world to a multipolar world. We're seeing that interests of all parts of the world are being better represented. This is not a declaration written by the United States and its allies. This is a declaration that is worldwide based on the world representation of the G20, and it was very skillfully managed, obviously, by the excellent diplomats of India, as well as the leadership of Prime Minister Modi. So I'm very, very pleased and congratulate India for this great accomplishment.
Right. Thank you so much. And Vikramjit Singh Sahni, sir, your comments on this. It's been a huge day of achievements for India, starting with the inclusion of the African Union, something that Prime Minister Modi had been pushing, and then the Delhi Declaration and the various agreements we've been pushing on climate as well as food security and supply chains.
Yeah, Gargiji, I think African Union becoming a permanent member of G20, commitment for strengthening the voice of developing countries, LDCs, food security, and their voice in global decision-making is very good. And as my earlier colleagues have said, it is good that broad consensus have been reached, and you have been discussing the Russia-Ukraine war. The declaration says that all states must refrain from the threat or use of force to seek territorial acquisition against the territorial integrity and sovereignty of political independence. And it also flags the use, the threat of use of nuclear weapon is inadmissible. So that way, there has been reference to this, and other takeaways have been tagged: the human sufferings with regard to global food and energy security because of these hostilities, supply chains, inflation, macro financial stability due to the Ukraine war has also been highlighted. So there has been an adequate reference. But the other 3 or 4 takeaways, Gargiji asked, in the trade, the declaration strengthening multilateral trading system with WTO. And Jaipur call for action had already enhanced MSMEs empowerment, and there is a adoption of G20 generic framework for global chain, but skilling, the global skill portal, the global skill mapping to address the skill gaps globally, which is coming, financial inclusion up to the last level, last mile. These are the important
lots of highlights for us to, really discuss in the days to come and really go into all the, micro aspects of it. But Saurabh Shukla also joining us from the Bharat Mandapam. And when we spoke to you earlier, at that point, we didn't know about the Delhi Declaration being announced today itself. So it's been quite a day of, achievements. And you were telling us earlier about how, various journalists and people from, from African countries had been coming across to you and talking about the achievements there. And now with this Delhi Declaration, it's been a completely landmark day for India.
Absolutely, Gargi. I would say India has hit it out of the park, if you ask me. It has been a day of creative diplomacy, and I can tell you from sources how hard they worked to negotiate this declaration. And Delhi Declaration has again reinforce India's global image as a consensus builder. It's a victory for India's consensus building. It's also a victory for Prime Minister Narendra Modi's, proactive diplomacy. He had put in a lot of political capital on India's G20 presidency. But as I was speaking to you earlier on, that making it inclusive, taking it across the country and making sure that, and I can tell you, they reached out, to the world leaders, even people like Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister spoke to him. That's the reason, and you saw the US completely, US President Joe Biden putting his weight behind India's G20 presidency. That's the reason why you've got a solution which is creative, yet takes care of the major point that India wanted to make, that this is not the time for war. And also the idea is to create economic inclusion, to move forward, to get a voice for the global south. African Union, the manner in which the Prime Minister invited the African Union, chair to come to the podium and take his chair, that itself, everything was well calibrated. And I would say from here on, India has etched out a new template of rule-based international order, which will borrow in and weigh in on a lot of takeaways that the Delhi Declaration has.
Absolutely, that start of
Gargi?
of the G20 summit when you had the announcement of the African Union. Well, let's talk more about opportunities for India. And Farzan Alawi, your comments. It's been very challenging for India, given the kind of tensions and geopolitical challenges that were there. But at the same time, a huge opportunity for India.
Exactly. But let me first express my happiness over the Delhi Declaration. In the morning, we were speculating that this will happen, not happen. But in my heart, somewhere, I thought that Prime Minister Modi will make it happen. And it did happen. I feel it is a lot of the personal charisma and the initiative the Prime Minister has been taking on a very strong and a personal front globally, especially with all the leaders who have been here. And this is one of the major outcomes of this. So this also puts us in a very responsible position in the times to come. And food security is something that the world is looking at us. And we very strongly feel, we being a food company, we feel that, we have not even started leveraging the potential that we have in the country. So now with the new FTAs being negotiated, the UAE is a huge success. And with the UAE CEPA, we can have gateway to the entire Africa. Now, another big takeaway from this is that African Union will be part of this.
Yes.
So it's a huge market for us to explore, and vice versa. The Nigerian president was here. He signed Indian investment of $14 billion. So it is going to be, a win-win for both the sides. And this African Union inclusion, I think, is a huge, big ticket victory. Secondly, I feel that the working of WHO and World Bank, IMF, was being criticized for a very long time. But Prime Minister Modi was the first person to be vocal about it. And I think it was about time where, whatever they're doing, I'm sure they're doing a great job. But for the greater good, like,
Right.
the concept of one family, one future, and one family, one earth. So this is, if you think about it, it gives you the whole big picture that Prime Minister Modi has in mind.
Right. Michael Boshak, just a quick comment from you. You were speaking to the Indian Sherpa, and he spoke about how he had the help of, South Africa and Indonesia and Brazil to really, speak to the other countries and convince them on this. So the bargaining power really of these countries as emerging markets was something that was quite interesting in arriving at the Delhi Declaration.
Yeah, very interesting. I've just come from the BRICS summit in Johannesburg, and what we saw there, I think, was India kind of caught in the middle between China and Russia, China throwing its weight around, really pushing this expansion. But then what you saw this summit, it's fantastic to see the African countries included in this way, that they're being given much more of a voice at the table. I think it probably points to some of the background work of the Americans as well, using their alliances with African countries. Look, at the end of the day, I think what's really going to be important is to convince many of these African countries who have been victims of debt trap diplomacy or dealing by China, and to a certain extent Russia, to say that, no, we're going to give you a fair shake. You can sign your deals with us, with India, with the G20, and they will be respected, and we will help alleviate poverty and that sort of stuff. Just very quickly, the other thing that I really like to see come out of this was the emphasis on the environment. I mean, I'm here in Bangkok, Thailand at the moment. I've just come from Africa, North America, and you can feel it all over. It's happening at a much, much faster rate, the degradation of the environment. So this is really a great thing.
All right, well, we'll slip into a short break. Do stay on, everyone. We're going to discuss more aspects of the Delhi Declaration. And there you can see visuals as more and more world leaders arriving for the dinner hosted by the Indian president. Do stay on. We'll slip into a short break.
23.
Welcome back. Well, this is our non-stop coverage of the G20, and now the delegates and world leaders have gone for dinner. 170 people invited for dinner hosted by the President of India. This is, in fact, in a hall there at the Bharat Mandapam in the Pragati Maidan complex itself. So now the official dinner taking place as the day one of the G20 summit has come to an end. And what a day it's been with huge achievements for India, starting with the inclusion of the African Union in the G20, which was announced right at the start of the summit, at the inauguration of the summit by Prime Minister Modi. And then he invited the representative right there to the high table. So that was very interesting to see, and the way it was all, carried out at the start of the G20 summit. Then around 3 o'clock at the start of the second session of the G20 summit was the surprise announcement, and quite an incredible announcement that a consensus had been arrived at and the Delhi Declaration had been agreed upon. So that has been a huge achievement for India. There had been so much speculation regarding whether or not we'd managed to, hammer that through by the end of tomorrow, but it happened today itself. So extremely significant. We've been discussing all these points and what it means, and the fact that Russia was not mentioned in that final Delhi Declaration, though the suffering in Ukraine was spoken about. But Professor Jeffrey David Sachs, I'd like to come to you to talk about the other big announcement today, the road and rail and shipping corridor announced by the US, India, Saudi, UAE, European Union. That has been another big announcement, and especially one in this region to counter the impact of China in the region with their Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, thank you. Yes, I don't agree that this is to counter China, or maybe that's the intention, but it is a very incorrect view of things. A corridor is a transport corridor. The Belt and Road Initiative promotes transport corridors.
Meet India's first and only smart grid mattress. इसकी patented technology में है 2,500 air channels that keep you cool all night long. ये दे softness that relaxes your pressure points and firmness that supports your back. Memory foam में बकवास. Sleep Company mattress is झकास. Log on to the sleepcompany.in and get your 100 nights trial now.
Here as a counter to China, that's how it's being viewed.
The U.S. has a very primitive mentality. I'm speaking of the U.S. government. The U.S. government has a very primitive mentality, which is it's us versus them. We need to be number one. China's Belt and Road is terrible. Our Belt and Road is good. This is primitive. I hope that India doesn't get caught up in this kind of nonsense. This is part of building global infrastructure. This is a very good and very positive announcement, but it is not an anti-China announcement. It is a road corridor. That's what it is. It's a good thing that it exists because it will expand trade between India, the Middle East, and Africa, and that's a good thing. But to see this as an anti-China initiative is exactly what's wrong with the way our world operates right now, which is us versus them, alliances and so forth. Exactly the success of today's diplomacy is to move beyond that rather primitive level. That's where Prime Minister Modi really deserves our congratulations, that he did not get caught in the trap of US-based hegemony or us versus them mentality. And I think we should see this corridor in a positive way as complementary with, perhaps connecting with, China's Belt and Road Initiative, not something to counter it.
All right, that's one way to look at it. And yes, definitely from India's point of view, it's a huge advantage for us and one that, we're looking at. Michael Boshicki, your comments on that?
Yes, I agree with Professor Sachs to a certain extent. I mean, it's great that these corridors are being created, especially integrating Africa more, giving them a more level playing field. Because again, at the BRICS summit, that's all we heard from many of these countries, is that it's very difficult for them to conduct trade with the outside world, even with each other, because of the reliance on the US dollar. So they're looking at ways of rebalancing that. And also looking at ways, for example, of once the resources are extracted from the soil in Africa, to do the refinement there as well, and ending centuries of dependence on other continents to refine their goods. So that's a real positive development. I agree with Dr. Saxon. I'd like to believe that he's got the right point of view here, but I still have a very, very strong lingering doubt that China does not look at it that way. They're very extractive, they're very manipulative, and I think that's a big reason why President Xi of China is not there, because he is actually backing out of many of these multilateral fora. He's looking more at a binary or multipolar world, and the fact that President Putin is not there, I should say, reflects his narrowing horizons and his narrowing ability to travel. So it is a complex set of circumstances, but
sure,
at the end of the day, we all hope for the same.
All right.
Let me just say, I do not agree with this way of looking at things. This is the Atlantic Council view of the world, which is that the North Atlantic runs the world. But the world is multipolar, and we should not try to exclude China or Russia or any other part of the world. We should be aiming for one Earth, one family, one future, the first line of the declaration.
Well, definitely,
today.
I think India has been of that view, and even with the tensions that we've had with China, we have been, our trade still remains quite high, so we haven't been very strident as as one would imagine. Vikramjit Singh Sahni, now I want to bring this discussion to the point of climate change, and climate action has been such a big part of the talk around the G20, and it's a part of the agreements, also the global biofuels alliance that has been signed on. So that is another huge aspect and a part of the India's G20 success.
Gagaji, first to just supplement what Professor Jeffrey said, that India have done a balancing act. So it is not a question to counter one belt, one road, but what the declaration says is that we can't have, because of hostilities and war, we can't have supply interruptions in global food and energy security. And for that, the declaration very clearly says that there should be fair and rule-based trade, based mostly emphasis on food and fertilizer trade, no export prohibitions or restrictions, reduce market distortions with relevant WTO rules. It's necessary. It is in the sense to free the trade multilateral so that the commodity prices, the food security is engaged. Now, answering your question on climate change and biofuels, first of all, I must say that the strengthening national and local capacities by financing and knowledge sharing to accelerate early warning, digitalization. There has been agreement on coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure, especially for developing countries who cannot afford mutual learning. And of course, again, there has been a lot of emphasis on multilateralism, revitalizing, whether China likes it, doesn't like it. But we have to have like one family, one global, but we have to necessarily see that we talk about so many things, skilling and agriculture and free trade and health delivery has been also said. A lot of emphasis have been given on health, universal access to health, facilitate more supplies, production of health equipments in developing countries and debt vulnerabilities. But Gagiji, we have to see declarations are declarations, but how much it will translate into real action, we will have to see, and how much it will stem global crisis and we emerge out of current challenges for safe, strong, inclusive, resilient and healthy future. As my earlier colleague said, it is not a binding. So we will have to really look at the tangible deliverables because
that's right, and
the
especially on the
taxation
issue of
meaning is
funding has been one big issue that has been a problem in these world negotiations around climate change. Fawzan Alawi, one of the big issues the world is facing is high food prices and inflation, and the kind of agreements here is something we're looking at hopefully soothing this inflation that we're seeing the world over.
See, before that, I would just want to comment on the climate change. There is a mention on lifestyle changes that we all should bring into our lives to control whatever, mitigate whatever little we can do as citizens of the country. Now, coming to the food prices globally, I think with the Delhi Declaration being signed and so many FTAs and there's so much of consensus on food security, fertilizer and fuel, there are a lot of non-tariff barriers which are existing for us. And as a country, we have been very, very lenient towards others. We have been allowing, we have been kind, and we've been generous. But it's time that, our goodness is reciprocated in the global arena. So that will also help balance food security, food inflation in a lot of countries.
Right.
And we can be very, very reliable and good partners in this sector.
All right. We're just wrapping up this discussion. Saurabh Shukla, your comments, given what we were talking about, the shadow of China over the discussions that have been taking place, and it's been a vacuum here without Vladimir Putin, of course, and Xi Jinping, and an advantage for India and the US.
Absolutely, Gargi. I would say that we should not. For instance, the corridor is a strategic corridor. You can't undermine that part. Yes, you should not make it China focused, but the message is clear. There are strands in this world, and what India has done is that it has adopted and brought to the fore its strategic autonomy yet again. That it's not kowtowing to any power bloc, but it will act in its own self-interest and strategic interest. And in this case, the message out of India's G20 Delhi Declaration is that it will work in the interest of the Global South, because the Global South needs a voice. And that's the reason why you see the entire Delhi Declaration has a multi-gamut approach, whether on climate change, whether on financial inclusion, on ensuring, I want to bring in India's DPI initiative, which will be adopted by many countries, not only in the Global South, but in the developed world as well. To me, that's something which is a celebration of India's innovation. That should not be undermined. And I would say that this is something which is also going to create, economic benefits from India, especially to young entrepreneurs and startup founders in the country as well.
Right.
Because it will also open doors of innovation. Absolutely.
Right, that is the hope, and something tangible emerging from this. Thank you all for joining us on the program today. It's been quite a day, the first day of the G20 summit, and the big announcements all came today itself, with the Delhi Declaration being announced. There you can see the Prime Minister along with President Murmu greeting all those arriving for the dinner hosted by the President.